Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gersay wash processed Ethiopia from Switch Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Switch, based out of Tokyo, Japan. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, and the first time I ever heard of this coffee roaster was a couple of years before starting this channel, when I saw their name on a list of the best coffee roasters in the entire world. So I made it a priority to visit their coffee shop when I was out in Tokyo, and truth be told, it was one of the more memorable experiences I had while I was out in Japan. So I definitely wanted to review their coffee when I got an opportunity. Here we are a couple of years later, and this is finally that opportunity. So I'm looking forward to discussing them, as this right here is day 33. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for Switch, this one's kind of interesting, so I think the best way to kind of articulate that is to compare it with some of its contemporaries. And we'd recently reviewed a couple of coffees from Apollon's Gold, and those were really light. This one's a little bit more developed than those. However, it's still significantly, or at least a fair bit lighter than a place like Sweet Bloom. Hopefully that gives you an idea, but with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 18, first impression, and the coffee did come out a little bit more robust than initially expected, as there was a slight roasty component to the cup. There was also a depth of flavors that did skew a little bit on the bright acidic side of things, especially in the finish, and it was complemented by this slight candied floral attribute, as well as a fair bit of citrus as well. So it left this okay first impression, but truth be told, I felt the coffee just needed to maybe aerate a little bit. It needed to have some air before we really got into the best of this. Day 20, this time ran it through the V60, and it was already a better cup, as there were a lot more of the Ethiopian characteristics, most distinctly this black tea-like base. That was complemented by a slight stone fruit attribute as well. Fair bit of brightness as well, continuing to skew a lot more on the citric side of things, so it was just better in general, but I definitely needed to work a little bit more with this one. Day 21, ran it through the April dripper, and this one actually felt very toned down, as it was coming through most distinctly in the finish with this grassy aspect to it. And that became a little bit more consistent throughout the time drinking this coffee. I believe that they have a lemongrass note listed on here. I don't exactly know what the flavor notes that they have on here are, but the tea-like base is complemented by a sugar cookie sweetness, and the entire cup remains moderate yet bright, so bright acidity at the same time, still a more moderate flavor profile to it. Day 23, ran it back through the V60, and there was definitely more of the brightness in the cup. So that listed lemongrass again continues to be present and very lingering within the finish itself. Brighter than expected citric components to it, with again more of that sugar cookie aspect, complemented by this slight candied citric aspect to the cup as well. That sweetness was a lot more in the background, as it still came out a little bit more slight than pronounced. Day 25, best day of the coffee to this point, and this one was run through the Chemex. So this is when I was finally starting to see some positive attributes from it, a little bit more so anyway, as the slight tea-like base was complemented well by a great florality. And the floral sweetness might have been the most distinct and pronounced sweetness to this coffee. I think they have a jasmine note listed on here. That would make a little bit of sense, although it did feel a little bit more candied than like maybe a jasmine could be. Even with that, fair bit of the citrus as well as the brightness yet again, but an extra bit of sugariness within the cup itself, so that gave it a little bit more of a sweetness. Day 27, another positive day to this coffee, as it continues to focus on the grassy brightness. So I didn't mention that in the previous day, but there was a lot of grassiness in this coffee, and that's going to be kind of demonstrated in both the citrus as well as the acidity in the tasting wheel, complemented by a fair bit again of the black tea-like characteristics, so a slight savoriness, black tea-like base. And the fruit sweetness is starting to open up as it does cool down, very much in a citric direction. So I think that they might have some citric notes listed on here, not entirely sure, but with a slightly sweeter citrus. Day 29, cup is leaning pretty heavily into the floral black tea characteristics yet again, and it's become a bit more savory than it had been in the past. Slight grainy aspect in the cup, as well as the citrus and acidity remain on the brighter side of things, but the cup continues to open greatly as it cools down. Best tip I have for this coffee is let it cool down a fair bit, as that's when you get the best from it. Day 31. Cup is beginning to open up a little bit more on the floral side of things, contrasting the more savory aspect from the previous day. A bit more sweetness to the cup, and also a little bit of that grainy quality yet again. Kind of touched on that briefly, but at this time I'm able to pick it up a little bit more. Lemongrass still seems apt, as well as the acidity continuing to remain on the brighter side of things, but a slight bit of citrus and herbality within the cup as well. So it's made for a very Ethiopian-like coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. It's the finish and the citrus fruit at a level 5. I'm not entirely sure I completely agree with that on this day. This coffee seems to have finally toned down a little bit, but the reason those were so high was because it did have a very bright grassy finish to it, a very citrus like lemongrass sort of finish to it. So it was one of those things where while it may have been on the lower side of the level 5, it was still so pronounced and it kind of lingered from the time finishing the cup that it justified that level 5 mark, as well as the citrus, which continued to remain on that slightly grassy side of things. So with a little bit more time, those have kind of been toned down, and on this day I would definitely push them back to a level 4, but I think I really wanted to put the point across that they were pretty strong, especially on the earlier days. I feel like if I really would have ramped up the temperatures on this coffee, then those would have been back to that level 5 mark. All right, a bunch of level 4s. So the acidity at a level 4, it feels a little bit more toned down today. I think that a level 4 is still probably pretty accurate for this coffee, but I could even see it being maybe a level 3. A lot of this coffee has kind of toned down, which I think it's maybe sort of balancing out, becoming a little bit more even in general. So that's a good thing for me. I think this coffee is better now than it was the past couple of days. So give it a little bit more time. I think this coffee would continue to improve. Florality at level 4. I've been mentioning the florality a lot. On the earlier days, it was probably one of the more distinct and pronounced aspects of this coffee. Even throughout the time drinking it, it was pretty consistent as well. So I think it justifies that level 4 mark. Savoriness, level 4. Yes, the black tea-like characteristic in this coffee is actually quite strong, and I feel like that's why it definitely justifies that mark, as it's a very sort of black tea-like flavor profile to the coffee. And a couple of level 3s. I guess the cleanliness is also at a level 4. I don't think we need to discuss that too much. It's a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. But the level 3s, the body level 3, interestingly, even with the Chemex, it felt like it might have had a little bit more body than initially expected. Definitely on the lower side of the level 3 still. As I'm drinking right here, I'm like, it might be a little generous to put it at that level 3 mark, but between a level 3 and a level 2. Saltiness, yeah, I think that's kind of complementary with the citrus as well, because it did have a slight bit of saltiness, but I think it might have also been attributed to that tea. And then I think the most important thing we need to discuss is, of course, that sweetness at a level 3 mark, and that's always a sticking point for me. It is a moderately sweet cup of coffee. I feel like if I was being really generous, I could push it at that level 4 mark, but I really kind of wanted to differentiate how some coffees really reach that level 4 mark. And even when they justify a lower side of the level 4, I put them at that level 4. But this one right here, it's probably at the very bottom end of that level 4. So that's why I bumped it down to the level 3, because it's not necessarily the sweetest. But I feel like one thing I've noticed with the Apollon's Gold coffees is I've let them sit for a little bit, and I tried them actually today, and they've opened up a little bit more into sweetness, and we're probably looking at a day 50 plus mark on that. So it's entirely possible with this coffee that we were going to get more sweetness with maybe another week's worth of rest, as I think it's starting to trend in that direction. But that being said, we have another switch coffee, and that one was a little sweeter, so that's why I'm fine with leaving this one at a level 3 to kind of showcase that this one wasn't quite as sweet as the other one. A bunch of level 2s as well, but I don't think any of those are necessarily worth discussing. Everything in this tasting will at least receive the level 2 mark, and I actually quite agree with the way it looks, maybe with the exception of lowering the body to a level 2, but for the most part, I think it's a pretty nice representation of what I was getting. Scratch that, the finish and the citrus now would go down, but for the duration of the time drinking this coffee, I feel like it's a pretty nice representation of what we were getting. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I thought it was fine. Truth be told, there was nothing that necessarily stuck out in a very defined manner for me on this one. I've made it pretty clear at this point that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the citrus. That's probably my least favorite of the fruit components you can get, especially when it comes to a washed coffee. And interestingly, I thought that this might have been a Loring coffee, but I actually think that they roast with a Probat. So I think that it just kind of goes to show that the roaster actually has a lot of influence. The person roasting the coffee still has a lot of influence on the way the coffee can turn out, in addition to the actual machine that they use, because this one actually threw me for a little bit of a loop. But even then, there were some positives to take away from it. The finish was interesting. It did have a lot of complexity to it. It did have a little bit of depth, and you can't always say that for washed Ethiopians, especially more modern washed Ethiopians. type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Somebody that does really like the citric aspects of coffee, especially the kind of lemongrass-like aspect to it, because this one had a lot of that. And even then, it was well complemented by a lot of additional attributes, most distinctly that black tea as well as the florality. Those had great depth to them as well, and they scored really high in this tasting wheel to just kind of go to show that there wasn't one attribute that really dominated this cup. I think if maybe they had raised the sweetness a little bit more, maybe if I was able to get a little bit more out of this coffee, then you're really seeing the entire tasting wheel come together and we would have had a really nice coffee. Still enjoyed this one, but I felt like maybe the best was either yet to come or there was still some adjustments I could have made to get better from this coffee. I think for the most part though, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Switch, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gersay wash process Ethiopia from Switch Coffee. Thank you for watching.